Hello and welcome to the Divorce Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Victoria Richardson. I'm using your Sunday name today, Vicky. I don't really know why. How are you doing, Vicky?
I'm great, thank you, Tamsin, and you can use whatever name you want for me.
And keep it polite for the podcast at least. Can I ask you to start by introducing yourself to our lovely listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Victoria Richardson, or Vicky, as we've already discovered. I'm a family law partner and head of department at Aticus Law solicitors, based in Manchester and Wilmslow.
Fantastic. And do you specialise in any particular area of family law, or do you do a bit of everything?
I do a bit of everything, but I would say the majority of my work is comprised of divorce and separation of couples. Yes.
Okay. And both financial and children?
Both financial and children, yes. And separate children proceedings weren't necessary if they don't arise from a divorce.
Fabulous. That is brilliant. And so today we're going to talk about the hairy subject of pets.
Hairy or non-hairy pets?
Hairy or non-hairy pets. So it's one of the things that we do occasionally get asked about, and it's something that we've never discussed on the podcast, even though we're nearly 6 full series in and 3 whole years into this podcast. We haven't actually even touched upon discussing pets in any previous episode. So we kind of thought it was about time. So pets. Have you had any experiences where people have had disputes about their pets in divorce situations?
Tamsin, it actually comes up more than you would possibly imagine. Certainly with parties who might not necessarily have any children. And in that scenario, pets are the children. They are loved as a member of the family and treated as a member of the family. So when you have a couple who are splitting up, the priority is who's going to look after the pet, because they both want to. Obviously, it's an emotional situation for everyone, but if you have someone who loves let's call it the dog for argument's sake, and wants to care for it, and the other party does as well, it does cause a lot of distress and upset.
Absolutely. It seems to me that it's more often, and I know someone's going to contact me and tell me I'm wrong on this, but it seems to more often than not be a dog, rather than, it doesn't tend to be the goldfish or the hamster.
No, it is more or less the ones that I have dealt with. Well, all of them is the dog, because I think for genuine reasons, a dog is probably a bit more of a family member rather than the goldfish that people forget to clean out or argue over who's going to clean out. So for the goldfish to go to the other party, I think.
Absolutely. So how have you seen these disputes resolved in the past? What sort of options are there for resolving these disputes?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that in law, pets are just seen as belongings, so they are treated the same as a car, even though they're possibly much more important than the family car. They are not treated in law the same as children are, and I think a lot of people quite often think that they should be treated the same way that disputes around children. So from the eyes of the law, whoever is the registered owner of the pet should keep the pet. However, it doesn't always work like that. A lot of disputes that I've resolved have centered around maybe spending time with the pet. And certainly I've had cases where the pet might be with one party, but the other party is more available to take it for a walk and has actually gone around and collected it and taken it for walks during the day. If one party is going on holiday, then the other party will care for the pets. But generally, the arrangements can be very similar to the arrangements for children, may I say. And I think probably a lot of dogs are the children of the family anyway, so it makes sense to the arrangements to follow the same kind of ethos.
Yep, I've certainly seen that happen amongst friends. We have a friend who used to drive down, lives up here in the Cheshire area, and used to drive all the way down to the home counties to pick up the dog for when they had care of it, which I think it was done maybe on a fortnightly basis, so they'd alternate, fortnights, and our friend would go down and pick the dog up, bring it back up here and care for it for the next fortnight, and then go and drop it back home again. But yeah,
it's a bit of a drastic scenario, but it doesn't mean that it happen if that's the most important thing. I think ultimately parties reach a point where the pet will start to stay with one party or the other, and gradually it filters off. But certainly, when people are splitting up and emotions are raw, these arrangements can be put in place, although I must stress they can't be included in any court orders. It's just got to be a general agreement between the parties, and if the parties don't agree, then the pet will go with the person who's the registered owner.
That was my next question. Is there going to be a court order to recognise who has the pet? And well, obviously no, that's not going to be the case. There's not going to be a similar to a children order where it's all set out in a court order.
You could have, as part of your financial order, and I've not seen one of these, but I don't see why you couldn't. You do have agreements regarding contents. So I don't see why in theory there couldn't be an agreement that the dog spends 1 week, with each. But it's not one that I've seen in all my 24 years of practice, so that popular. And also legal fees, quite often the cost of arguing over the dog can be quite extreme, when it's probably cheaper just to go and buy another dog, to be quite oh, it's not the same dog, I appreciate that, because I certainly wouldn't be giving my dog away. The husband can go, but the dog can't.
I've heard that said before as well. Absolutely, people seem to feel like that. The other thing that often comes into certainly my work, and I'm sure it does into yours, is the costs, because obviously owning a pet is expensive, and even if you're not going to have shared care, feels very strange saying that, of the dog, or whatever other animal, how does the costs of maintaining the animal that you will have got as a family pet, how does that come into the divorce settlement?
Well, I think it's something that's got to be just looked at on its own, and it will very much depend on the case. You may have, for example, the typical situation whereby the pet would go with the children of the family, and the wife, for argument's sake, obviously the roles could be reversed, but she can't afford to pay the fees. So it's whether the other party is prepared to contribute towards the fees, and if they can't, or they're not prepared to, then there's an issue about whether they keep the dog. It's really down to that, really. The person who has the dog, has ownership of the dog, should be the one paying for the pet's fees, unless there is an agreement that they split the time, in which case it would make sense for pet fees and insurance to be split equally. It's a common sense, I say common sense in the loosest term, because obviously in these sort of cases common sense goes out the window a little bit, but who has the dog should pay for the dog, realistically, unless the parties agree otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely.
In some situations, one party can't have the dog because of housing conditions, if they're moving into an apartment or a place that's not suitable for animals or pets, then that also means that the party's got to have the dog, or causes difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, the way we talk about it, it is coming to a common sense resolution for it, but as we know, often the common sense conversations about these things can get hot-tempered, I suppose, is the thing, or acrimonious, because there's a battle over various other things, then this sorts of thing can come into it.
It just gets them build and all the other emotion, but funnily enough, it tends to sometimes be that the pet is the one thing that causes more emotion than everything else, because, as I've said earlier, they're a member of the family and they're a character, and when families are separating and splitting up, then nobody wants to say goodbye to the pet ultimately, which is what someone may be having to do.
Yeah,
I've also
absolutely.
cases actually whereby if there are children of the family, the pet goes with the children of the family. So when the children spend time with dad, the pet goes too, and when the children spend time with the pet, goes too. So I have had those kind of cases, but they're more rare. The pets tend to stay with one family member, with the other person helping out if wishing to.
I guess that's easier if it's a dog, less if it's like a tropical fish tank or
or reptiles.
Reptiles. Yes, absolutely.
They need a lot of
Absolutely.
care, the reptiles, don't they? It's all about the temperature of the tank and all the rest of it. They probably need more than the dogs.
You know a lot about this. So I guess one question, and this will apply to more things than just the pets, but do you have any tips or suggestions about how to take the heat and the emotion out of some of these conversations that people might be having? Because you don't, in law, the dog, where the dog goes is not going to be particularly relevant. Presumably, you're not going to go to court to try and resolve that as a situation, but there are other things where the emotion gets involved as well. Do you have any tips?
Well, as a family lawyer, we always encourage parties to go to mediation to see if they can resolve any disputes between them, because mediation means that their relationship moving forward, even though they're not together, will be much more amicable, and any agreements that they reach between themselves is much better than the courts becoming involved or long-term correspondence through solicitors. So mediation is also always an option if they want to go and discuss it with an independent mediator to try and resolve the position, especially when you've got two people who they both want to own the dog. They can go to a mediator and get assistance with reaching an agreement that everybody's happy with. And using a mediator can also be significantly less from a cost point of view than using solicitors involved in it. And solicitors are only going to follow the law, so if there's a dispute, whereas a mediator will help to find some middle ground that suits everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with mediation, you've got both parties there and you've got the mediator there, and they're there to almost referee the situation, aren't they, to provide a neutral person in the room, so that hopefully the arguments and discussions don't get as heated as perhaps they would if you were round your own kitchen table trying to have that conversation between you.
The other tip I often say to clients is, if they don't feel the need to go to mediation, is go and have the conversation somewhere neutral. If you have a conversation in the family home and emotions are rising high, then that's when your shouting and screaming starts and one person storms out. If you go to the local coffee shop, people are much more well behaved. Yes, one person could leave, but you don't get the same acrimony taking place between people. Who can be more civilized and hopefully, things agreed in that way. So if they don't feel that mediation is appropriate, then that also is an option. Move out of the environment that you're in to somewhere where you'd be embarrassed if you start shouting and screaming at your other half. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's really
not
good advice.
For obvious reasons. Of alcohol.
We had all our pre-divorce discussions in Costa Coffee in our local town, so they certainly benefited from that as far as we were concerned.
Well, it worked though, Tamsin, didn't it? You probably weren't, didn't say quite the same things that you might have done in the family home,
Well, we might have said them, but we said them quietly and calmly.
The same volume.
I think something else that somebody said recently, and it might have been our friend Susan Lee, was treat it as a business transaction. Try and sort of step back and take the emotion out of it. And it is difficult when it's a loved family pet, but try and kind of see the other person's side as well, and see it as a business transaction and negotiate on that front rather than having it emotionally charged. And I always think that it's like looking after somebody else's children. you know, if I'm looking after someone else's children, it's a lot easier because they don't know which buttons of mine to press. If I'm looking after my own, they know exactly how to wind me up.
Yeah. And I always say to my clients, think about how you would feel if you were on the other party, you know. So if you're the party who has the pet, and how would you feel if you've grown to love that pet and you just have to say goodbye, as well as you're saying goodbye to the life that you've known? It's harsh, you know. And I think sometimes when you encourage people to look at the other side, that helps to just appreciate them, for them to appreciate a bit more, you know, how the other person's feeling, and help to reach an agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly the case. Another thing that I just wanted to touch on is that there was some press, I think it was a couple of years ago, about something called a pet nuptial, and I'm going to be really careful because I'm not sure if that that was only used by the particular firm in question. But is it possible to put down future plans for your beloved pet when you get them, so that you document what will happen to them if you do split up in the future? Is that possible?
I suppose from a family law point of view, nothing is impossible. You can, you know, you can make an agreement as to what will happen. If you do such, I haven't done one, I might add. But if the relationship broke down and there was a dispute about the pet, the court would use that, should it have to, not within family law proceedings, but within civil proceeding, to look at what the intentions were of the parties when they first made that agreement and what they said was going to happen. So anything you record in writing is always beneficial in case, in the future there should have to be some kind of court proceedings. But having said that, I haven't done one. But as lawyers, we're happy to have a go at anything. We'll write an agreement up.
Fair enough. I suppose. Sorry,
it wouldn't be legally binding, but the court could look at it to decide on what the intentions were at the time of making the agreement.
Okay, and I guess that we should just touch on prenuptials and postnuptials, because I know that the majority of people who are listening to our podcast are going to be probably going through separation and divorce, but it's not unusual for them to also be entering into a new relationship as well. So it probably is worth us touching on pre and post nuptials. So there's always been a rumour in when I speak to anybody about these that they're not worth the paper they're written on. So
really, okay.
Not lawyers, I hasten to add. So could you just tell us just briefly what they are and how they work, and are they worth the paper they're written on?
So prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements are basically the same document. One will be prepared before a couple get married, and the other will be prepared afterwards, purely maybe because of a time point of view. If they follow certain legal guidelines, then they will be as pretty much legally binding as you can get them. All right. So if you both parties take independent legal advice, if they are prepared well in advance of any wedding, if they are prepared with full disclosure of each other's finances, and there are certain clauses in there, then the court will treat them as pretty much legally binding. If the court is asked to address whether a prenuptial agreement is binding or not, it will depend on the situation at the time. And the only thing that would upset that really is probably if there are children involved and the parties haven't looked at the prenuptial agreement once children have been born to see if that should still apply and whether it's reasonable. So any agreement has to be reasonable. But generally, yeah, they are very important documents, certainly where second marriages are concerned, and we're seeing a lot more people wanting to enter into them. So yes, no, they're worth a lot more than the paper they're written on, shall we say.
There's definitely yeah, so definitely worth looking at, particularly if you're into the realms of a second marriage, to protect your assets, or to look at what position you want to be in if the second marriage should come to an end. Yes. Which obviously you want to avoid, but yeah, so but these things happen, don't they? What just I suppose just tack onto that, what happens if the circumstances have changed massively since since the prenuptial. So, for example, one party's taken what was a relatively small business and built it up into something incredibly successful, worth considerably more than it was on the prenup.
Well, your prenup, but the majority of prenups basically say that certain assets will remain in the sole name of each party. And if that asset is in the sole name of that particular party and they go on to build it up, well, good luck to them. The court will only get involved if it means it's going to be particularly unreasonable to the other party. And obviously, every case is dealt with on its own facts. But if it meant like the other party was going to have difficulty rehousing themselves, then obviously that's the main concern. But the court will look at the needs of the other parties and make sure that they are both satisfied, irrespective of what wealth is involved.
Brilliant. That's really useful. Just worth touching on it. Well, we were chatting about the situation around pets. Just before we go, is there anything you would like to add on the subject of pets?
I don't think so, really. It's just a difficult one, isn't it? You know, as I said earlier, people can get so emotional about the pets, and quite, you know, often it happens more than you would expect. Want the lawyers to sort it out, and we find ourselves in a difficult position that it's something so emotional and that both parties love that we actually are restricted to what we can do. So I'd always advise for the parties, if they can't agree themselves, to maybe seek advice from a mediator to take away the acrimony and see what arrangements can be made, because there's always a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Good advice, and mediation certainly can help in those situations. If anybody should want to contact you, how can they do that?
So they can email me at victoria.richardson@Aticus Law, that's 1t1c.co.uk.
Wonderful. And we'll pop that in the show notes as well, so that if anybody does want to get hold of you, they can do so. And Vicky will be joining us a lot more in series 7 of the podcast, which is coming in the early spring this year. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your insights as always. And thank you for joining us. And we will see you again soon.
Thank you.